Hello, welcome to our final session of Israel at a Crossroads, Expanding the Conversation. This series was based on the themes that emerged at our recent JTS convening, Israel at a Crossroads, Navigating Religion, Democracy, and Justice. And today we're going to talk about all three. At the convening, both Rabbi Ayelet Cohen and Rabbi Gordon Tucker, who are with us today, moderated sessions related to issues around minority rights and pluralism, respectively. These sessions, like so many of the sessions at the convening, raised enormous questions, and not necessarily with the time to answer them. I can't promise that we're going to have answers at the end of this, but I am really interested in the ways in which the issues that emerged, how they will respond to them. And I'm excited to have Chancellor Emeritus Arnold Eisen discussing these concerns with Rabbis Tucker and Cohen. So as before we go forward with the discussion itself, I want to thank our sponsor today, JTS trustee Yael Asbel, who sponsored at the Navi set level. And I also want to thank our community. For many of you are donated to support the series. Thank you so much for making this kind of learning possible at JTS. We're not sure what our next step is in terms of webinars, but we'll keep you guys posted. We know you've been a loyal and wonderful audience. And if you have any really big requests, you can email me, elgettinger@jtsa.edu, and I'm happy to kind of think about what you're interested in. Let's get on to the program today. The title of our program is Meeting the Moment, Urgent Questions for Israeli and American Jews. And it's my pleasure. I'm going to introduce all three of our speakers, and then I'm going to turn it over to them to kind of hash out these big questions. There will be some time for Q&A, so please put your questions in the chat to me, and I will be answering them, or I will not be answering them. I will be asking them, and our panel will be discussing them. So first, I'm going to introduce Arnold Eisen. He is the Chancellor Emeritus and Professor of Jewish Thought at JTS. He was Chancellor from 2007 to 2020. And one of the things that he was really focused on was graduating highly skilled, innovative leaders who bring Judaism alive in ways that speak authentically to Jews at a time of rapid and far-reaching change. And I can't think of, while that was very true in 2020, how much more of a need that is in 2025. Also with us is Rabbi Ayelet Cohen. She's the Pearl Resnick Dean of the Rabbinical School and the Dean of the Division of Religious Leadership. Rabbi Cohen works to shape the next generation of Jewish clergy, cultivating students' spiritual and intellectual lives so they can meet the challenges of Jewish life with wisdom, creativity, and resilience. This week is commencement, so thank you even more so, Rabbi Cohen, for being with us, because I know this is the end of a big process, and we will be ordaining new rabbis this week. Prior to her work at JTS, she served as the director of the New Israel Fund in New York and the inaugural director of the Center for Jewish Living and the David H. Sonnabend Center for Israel at the Marlene Meyerson JCC in Manhattan. And finally, we have Rabbi Gordon Tucker, who's the Vice Chancellor for Religious Life and Engagement. He focuses on enhancing Jewish life at JTS, enriching our study of Judaism with joy and deep understanding that only a lived experience can provide. He had a long career both with JTS and as the rabbi at White Plains Jewish Center, and he has been a kind of integral, a pillar of the conservative movement, and I'm very excited to see how this conversation goes. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues and let them discuss. If you have technical questions, please message my colleague Tani Schwartz-Herman. And as I said, please send your questions to me throughout the session. Thank you so much. And without further ado, Arnie.
Thanks, Ellie. So Gordon and Ayelet, you each chaired a session of this conference. But before we talk in particular about the sessions that you chaired, which, as Ellie said, focused on issues of pluralism and democracy and justice, I want to know if you had reactions to the conference itself. What did you walk away with? We had urgent questions. We knew we were at a convening. Those questions have, if anything, become even more urgent and more convoluted in the 6 weeks since the convening ended. But what were your immediate impressions after those 2 intense days? Perhaps we'll start with Gordon.
Okay, thank you. Um, so I want to point out one major impression that I had. It was that how many of the sessions that had, for me, somewhat unexpectedly, had an underlying substratum. I'm not sure that I would have predicted what became my clear sense as the convening went on. The sense that what would resonate the most with this session on religious pluralism that I chaired, that what resonated most with it would be the session on national libraries and museums. First of all, religion, you can argue, is an art form, so there is something there. But there was in both of those, for example, an urgency of getting away from binary categorizations and to opening up to the necessary continuum along which all the important matters of a culture and a polity lie. That was a beautiful thing. I'm sorry, that was a phone call coming in. Had a that was a beautifully articulated in that session on the library and the museum. But there was something about we're struggling with this religiously. We're struggling with this here in the United States, and the Jewish community has no exemption from this. I've recently have been taken to recalling and kind of, it's a kind of a quip that not so many years ago, I used to admonish students when they were still in thrall to what was a very simplistic understanding of modernist thought, that they shouldn't neglect the fact that there are black and white areas surrounding the vast areas of gray. Now I find I have to do the exact opposite. Now I have to admonish students today not to forget that there's a whole sea of gray in between the black and white, and it's precisely in that zone that wisdom and ethics tend to grow and to get refined. So this, by the way, was true of the Siegel lecture as well, with Avichai Mandelblit giving that talk, because I discovered in the course of the convening that Professor Mandelblit's political views were actually a good deal harder to the right than I had thought. And yet here he was breaking a binary by bringing that very perspective to a very full-throated defense of democracy. So throughout this convening, I think there was a recognition that that we had gotten too bifurcated, too polarized, not so surprising, but perhaps surprising that so many of the sessions, whether it was about trauma or whether it was about art or whether it was about, as Ayelet will talk about, Rabbi Cohen will talk about the the issues of democracy and Jewish statehood and all of that, they all, one way or another, were sitting on a foundation, a conceptual foundation that turned out to be a source of some hope for me. That there are people thinking in this way, that we need that the crossroad right now is is pointing us to different paths. One of which clearly has to be the opening up of thought and the recognition that there is, as Masorti used to say, Yesh yoter miderech achat liot Yehudi. There's more than one way to be a Jew. There's more than one way to be an Israeli. There's more than one way to be a patriotic Israeli. There's more than one way to envision what Jewish flourishing will be, and those things have to be in conversation with one another.
Ayelet?
So I appreciate that you started by asking us what questions we walked away with, because I think this is really a time of questions and not answers. And that was very, very present for me throughout the convening, because we brought in a lot of different voices and a lot of important conversations. We're at a time right now where we are filled with so many questions and the temptation to look away out of despair, out of anger, out of grief, out of exhaustion. And part of what really stood out for me from the convening was when we look towards, when we lean in instead of looking away, and bring together so many brave and brilliant practitioners who are devoting their lives to this work, we can kind of push past that despair and that tendency to want to close our eyes. So I really appreciated that that was very much the feeling of the convening, and that it raised many questions, I think is very accurate for our time. Like Gordon, I really enjoyed the session on the National Library and the Jewish Museum. And part of that is it brought in different modalities, just like we brought in so many different voices and heard from different people. Not everybody learns in the same way. Not everybody connects to the world in the same way. And to remind us that material culture, that art, that sacred texts are such a huge part of our history, our legacy, our experience, I think is so important. And also that not every conversation about Israel in all of its complexity has to be at a high temperature and at a high pitch. It's possible to engage on many, many levels and to connect through culture, through literature, through people who are seeking deep connection through those media, I think can open some doors that are very important. And lastly, you know, you mentioned, Gordon, how Mandelblit, you know, was at the same time quite hardline on the right and also a very, very vocal advocate for democracy. And I thought that too was an important reminder that democracy is not a partisan issue. And
Yeah.
the discourse in our country right now, and much of what we hear in Israel from certain factions in the government right now is trying to undo that truth, that democracy is not partisan and it is an essential building block of a free society.
So Ayelet, that's a natural segue to the session which you chaired about democracy and the nation state law. Do you want to say a few words in retrospect about how that session changed your view of things, if it did?
So I was really honored to have the opportunity to chair that session and to be able to have in conversation an Israeli Jewish scholar and an Israeli Arab scholar talking to each other and talking to our community about these important issues. So our session was really based on two important texts. One is Israel's Declaration of Independence, and I think Ellie's going to share the link to that and to one paragraph in particular, which talks about Israel's founding promises of equality for all of its citizens, regardless of race, religion, gender, etc. And the nation state law, which was passed by the Israeli government a few years ago and accomplished a number of things, including demoting the status of Arabic to not being an official language, even though there's a significant Arab minority in Israel. Around 21% of the population is Arab, and really talking about the character of the state. And I thought it was very, very powerful to have these two voices, Israeli and a Palestinian citizen of Israel, together. It was very notable to me how many people in our community had not really spent time with or heard the voice of an Arab citizen of Israel, and how moving it was. You could see in the room to hear from Nasreen, who is a scholar, a mother who is, it's fluent in Hebrew, who's more comfortable speaking in Hebrew than she is in English, about her experience of growing up in Israel and raising kids in Israel as an Arab, and how much it's personal to her, to her community, to her family, to continue to work for Israeli democracy, even though things continue to get harder and harder. It was very, very moving to see the reaction to her. And to me, it really underlined how important it is, again, for us to hear from different voices, not only the people that we're used to hearing from and that we talk to most frequently, but to make a point of trying to hear from voices that we're not regularly in conversation with.
Gordon, you had a session on religious pluralism in Israel. And
Yeah.
when we were talking about this convening in advance, we reflected that the notion of religious pluralism is actually crucial to the political pluralism that Ayelet was just speaking about. Did you come away with that conviction as well?
Yeah, I did. But let me just say before I get to that, just to underscore, just how powerful that session that Ayelet was chairing was, and that Nasrin, not only was it important for people to hear her, but it was clear how important it was for her to be with us and for her to be heard, and how grateful she was for being there in the way that she was, not as a token, but as someone who is clearly understood to be an integral part of this conversation. So that was a huge moment in the convening. So in the session that I chaired, so it was on religious pluralism, and I'm actually going to take issue with you, Arnie, on one little thing here, and you may have just thrown it out, but you said at one point in our preliminary conversations that you felt that session, in a way, you had the sense that October 7th had never happened.
Exactly.
But I want to push back a little on that. So to me, one of the most important things that was said in that session, and it was said by Rabbi Seth Farber, who was there as an Orthodox rabbi and the founder and the director of ETIM, which does a lot of outreach and does huge numbers of conversions to Judaism, and is really a kind of standing in opposition to the narrow vision of the chief rabbinate. He said the following: "We are not a shtetl anymore." And here was an Orthodox rabbi lamenting the unwillingness of a Jewish religious establishment in a sovereign Jewish state to imagine flowerings of Judaism that would invite multitudes of Jews of different enveloping cultures from around the world and different life experiences that would invite them to a national renaissance. And in fact, the gateways narrowed more and more as the years went by. So I used to have a kind of a cute way of thinking of this, which turned out to be wrong on two counts, but I'm going to tell you what it was. I used to think about, that moment when you move from black and white to color in the classic Wizard of Oz movie. So I used to think of it as that's what Zionism was supposed to be: an opening up of Jewish creativity, an interaction of Jewish cultures to create this spectrum in which Jews could find themselves and contribute. But here's what I came to understand, that, two things that were wrong about that image. One was shame on me, and the other is shame on the religious establishment. Well, first thing I was wrong about is that the Judaism of the shtetl was, of course, not black and white and lacking in color. There was plenty of color there. That was kind of a lazy assumption that was just simply wrong. But the second error was that Zionism was sure to create the colorful and alluring spectrum. And the rabbinate insisted on black and white. And sure enough, the society followed their lead, categorizing themselves for a long time into this binary of dati and chiloni, of religious and secular. So the terrible paradox, therefore, is that the history of religion in the Jewish state was for too long the exact opposite of that comfortable Wizard of Oz image, it took the color of Judaism that even in the often oppressive diaspora, had made its presence known, and it turned it into a black and white film. That's what Farber was lamenting. And that's what Rakefet Ginsburg, the executive director of the Masorti movement, who was his opposite number on this panel, she was, of course, corroborating it. But she also said very, very persuasively and very perceptively that not only was October 7th not present there, but the importance of religious pluralism that brings people in it's crucial, because religion is part of the healing. Faith is part of the healing, a shared faith that people have, even though they have differences of politics and they have differences of accent and language, all sorts of things. A shared faith is hugely important to heal a society that was traumatized and tormented in the wake of October 7th. But there was hope, because each of them was able to point to trends in society that are pushing back. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, thinking about this brought me back to what I think is a really remarkable poem that Bialik wrote in 1910. And it's called, the English is Before the Bookcase, Lifnei Aron HaSfarim.
Yeah.
And just a couple of the moving lines there. He says, he's speaking to the books. My fingers handle your parchments. My eye wearily scans between your lines, seeking quietude between the crowns of your letters. I try to discern in you the wake left by my wandering soul, and to find in you once again my spirit's awakening in its birthplace and early home. You who can read my heart and soul, why are you silent? Can it be that your golden eyelids have nothing to say to me in my heart? Or can it be that you do, but it is I who have forgotten your language? So the melancholy of these words also contain with them that yearning that both presenters gave evidence for, and that to me is a real source of hope, and I hope it was for the assembled people came to the convening as well, and for the people on this screen today.
Thank you both. I came away from those two sessions with the following reflection, that one of the driving forces behind the nation-state law was that we all were speaking about Judaism about Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And for some people who were pushing the nation-state law, that wasn't satisfactory. They needed to argue that the state of Israel was more a Jewish than a democratic state, that democracy was a secondary value, and that Judaism.
And democracy, as long as it doesn't get in the way, right?
Yeah, and it's like Gordon, what your comment, reflecting on Seth Farber, was that for some Jews, Judaism is antithetical to democracy, and the notion of democracy inside Judaism is you can't have different views about what Jewish flourishing means. You can only have one kind of Jewish flourishing in the Jewish state, and therefore, Kal v'chomer, how much more so would it be true that we can't allow room for non-Jews, or not primary room, only secondary room, guest status in the Jewish state. And so the notion, I think there's a whole lot of Jewish education needs to go on here, because I think fundamental to our notion of Judaism is there are democratic values that are inherent in Judaism. They're not opposed to Judaism, quite the opposite. So even though the Torah doesn't use the word democracy, and the rabbis don't endorse a concept of democracy, they're not living in the 18th or 19th or 20th century. Nonetheless, there are notions of human dignity, which in our day and age human dignity is assured only by democratic forms of government. And so we've got a problem here of maybe, as you said, that democracy is not a political issue, but it's certainly become one.
Well, I said it's not a partisan issue. It's definitely
an issue. It's a political issue, but it shouldn't be a partisan issue. But we have partisans of a notion of Judaism who think that Judaism is opposed to democracy. And what this session bore out for me was how complex this is, and how we as American Jews, if we're going to relate to this country as we must, I certainly agree with what you said, that we can't turn away from the complexity. Your session in particular made me think that maybe what we need to do in our American Jewish views of Israel is much more education about the non-Jewish parts of the state of Israel and the varieties of Jewish culture, but also the varieties of non-Jewish culture, and get at this. It's not. I don't want to.
Well, it's
Without
interesting
alluding.
for you to say that because, if we look back at the Declaration of Independence, the founders were certainly aware of people other than Jews who were living in the land and who were going to be part of this new state.
Right.
And so if we are, it was baked into the fundamental language of that document. If the way that we're teaching Israel now is erasing that reality, we're doing a disservice to the reality of Israel and of Israelis and the lives of Israelis. And similarly, creating a false dichotomy between Judaism and democracy is so dangerous. And of course, there are certain factions who are very eager to do that right now. And it's as important for us to say it is absolutely authentic Judaism to care deeply about democracy and to understand that Judaism and democracy are intertwined and are not at odds with each other. I think we have a real responsibility to be having that conversation out loud right now.
I want to remind you both and others on on the screen today who may have been listening to it at the time of a really striking thing that that Raquel Euclides of the National Library said. She pointed out libraries are places where all kinds of different perspectives on life, all kinds of different ideas, competing ideas, contradicting ideas can all live together on the same shelf. And we saw a photo that they put up of not only the ideas living together on the shelf, but the people whose ideas they are, and the people who are trying to absorb and read those ideas are all sitting together at the same table. You had an Arab woman and a Haredi man and someone who would call himself a secularist, and all these people around the same table, and that that's a matter of dignity and respect of being able to be there. And I never really thought of libraries as a repository of the value of respect. But if you look at the shelves, that's exactly what it is. And by the way, just a little thing, the fact that libraries have so many of their, including ours now, unfortunately, have so much of their collection off-site, it deprives you of some of that browsing and seeing some of that pluralism. But I want to mention one other thing, because Raquel Ginsburg gave a vignette that happened to her, and it was kind of a middle ground between the rejection of democracy and a full pluralism. And it was the fact that she was meeting, she said, for several hours with Rav Eliezer Malamed, a Haredi rabbi. And in the end, he said to her, I don't accept your way of doing Judaism, and I don't believe in pluralism. I believe there is only one way. But I also think that you have to have some space to do it your way. And therefore, I'm going to tell people they shouldn't be disrupting things at your part of the kotel. But don't expect me to, to uphold, with equal legitimacy your way of doing Judaism. That I can never do. And I'm not sure quite what to do with that. I mean, it's, on the one hand, a little bit of a breath of fresh air, and it's not silencing and it's not canceling, to use the current term, but it's it's what our colleague on the seminary faculty, Ben Summer, has quoted someone else. I don't remember who he was quoting, is calling it Chevy theology. I shouldn't call it that because I drive a Chevy myself, but the idea of you may have I have the Cadillac, right? You may just have a Chevy, but it's at least it's getting you somewhere, but you don't have the whole truth. There's something of that there, and I'm not sure whether this is, I'm just raising the question whether this is a ray of light in the landscape there now, or just kind of a passing human nicety.
Something else came up for me when you were kind of raising the question of religious pluralism post October 7th, and is it different? Some of the for me, most inspiring efforts, even in this incredibly painful time, and Tamara Applebaum has been part of this, has been the intersection of different Jewish communities. For example, in Jerusalem, where you have coming together conservative, Masorti, unaffiliated, open Orthodox, Reform rabbis and communities coming together in support of hostages, to support each other. They are some of the many voices at the Motzei Shabbat protests in support of the hostages. There's now in Jerusalem on Shabbat, kind of right after Shul, a gathering of Jews from different denominations who come together on the train tracks right outside of Kol HaNeshama, where for many months, too many months, there was a huge banner with Karina, one of the women who was hostage in Gaza, who was finally released fairly recently, and so now it's been replaced with another banner. But that's become a gathering place of people from different communities who, after their own shul, come together to pray together. And that's, obviously in the more open side of Orthodoxy and the progressive areas, but I think it's a beautiful portent for what's possible when people actually are interested in thinking about working together for something important. This group was also part of a very, very powerful and painful gathering. When I was in Israel in December for the Rabbinical Assembly Convention, that was the Shabbat that the story of Dinah was read, and there was a vigil on Friday morning in Jerusalem, sponsored by all of these different communities and rabbis, focused on the issue of sexual violence on October 7th and among the hostages. And 2 mothers of hostages were present, and all of these rabbis that I'm talking about. And it was a very, very powerful and pluralistic gathering to say that, these communities cannot stay totally separate from one another, because if we're looking at this from a religious frame, if we're thinking about how do we continue to pray, to be in relationship with God, to be in community in such devastating times, we need each other. And there are some incredibly beautiful prayers and liturgy that have come out in this period of time, written by some of our Israeli colleagues.
Maybe let's get back to something you mentioned in passing, Arnie, but I know you didn't mean it in passing. We just haven't gotten to it, which is the matter of Israel education and how we educate people. One of the things we're seeing in our country here in America right now is clearly, I can only imagine it's a fear that people in a certain political stance have of telling the true story of the United States. It's got to be censored out. We have to sanction schools that are telling the truth, because we're afraid of people knowing the truth. And I think something like that has long been the case. Certainly, I think probably even more so among American Jews than among Israeli Jews, precisely because so much Israel is so much of the of the bedrock of what people believe is going to hold on to our next generation, that this is going to be their real connection to Judaism, that we have to make sure that they never have a bad thought about it. And I think we all believe, that telling the true story of the United States is a way of not only being faithful to the truth, but preventing people from feeling that they were lied to throughout their whole childhood, and wondering what that means about the whole enterprise. So there's a lot at stake in this, and we had a session on this in the first convening back in October on Zionism in America, with Peter Geffen and some others were talking about this. I think this is an urgent matter, and I know I'm going to be in Camp Ramah for a few weeks in a month. I know they wrestle with it all the time, because, like schools, camps have parents who want to be sure that their children are getting a good shot of an immunization against anti-Semitism and making sure that they have, a strong and inviolate connection to Israel and all things Jewish, and they're just fearful of opening up the gates of truth.
I also have a sense that this Israel business is really complex, and you go to a convening like the one we had, and you come away with the sure certainty that it's a lot more complex even than you thought it was before. And so, how are you going to deal with this? And how are you going to deal with it from afar? And one of the ways you're going to deal with it, as Ayelet said, is not dealing with it. And for a long time, I would say, faulting ourselves that our American Jewish education about Israel was mythic. We held up a myth of a perfect country that answered and the needs of the Jewish people and did no wrong. And and we are reaping the whirlwind, as it were, at a time of great necessity for American Jews to turn towards Israel, not away from Israel. We've got to give them an Israel that's much more complex than the one we had before, without alienating people from this complicated reality and having it engage them. And I like you, I'm hopeful that we can do this because people in their private lives, in their individual lives, in their families, are used to dealing with complexity. Complexity is in the structure of our families these days, in our relationships, our friendships, our schooling. Nothing is simple anymore in the society of ours. And so to think that people can't deal with this when it comes to Israel, one of the most important features of their Jewish identities, I think is a mistake. So we've got to find ways to do a better job of keeping people close, dafka, by bringing them close to the complexity.
This is one of the things about love,
Yeah, love. Yeah.
It's no great thing to be loved as your perfect self. What you really want is to be loved as your real self.
As you are.
As you are.
Right. As you want to be. So as long as you raise this issue, Gordon, I said that I've often had the thought that we Jews are too far away to really pronounce about these kinds of things. And what I've come to think is that there's an advantage to being far away. I mean, we talked a lot about trauma. It's sad but true that Israeli society is traumatized in so many different ways right now. And when you're traumatized and when you're living under fire, literally friends of ours in Jerusalem are still running to the safe rooms, sometimes multiple times a day because of Houthi missile attacks. And friends of mine still have their children and grandchildren fighting in Gaza. And now we have a renewed battle in Gaza going forward, now another offensive. It's very hard in those circumstances to take big picture and think about things from a distance. And maybe we actually owe it. We owe our voices and not our silence. And maybe this is a time to combine humility and boldness and speak up more than we've been used to speaking up.
I think that if we are in real relationship with Israelis, we can help kind of gauge the most productive ways to do that. Gordon, you started off the whole convening talking about love and critique and different models for that. As I spend time, and again, I do think it's so important to be in close relationship with real live Israelis, not the idea of Israel, but actual real live Israelis. And some of us are blessed to have those people in our families. Some of us have close friends. Any of us who's involved in a Jewish community, there's a way to hook in and develop those relationships. Your shul, your synagogue, your JCC would be so happy to help you build those connections. There is nothing that can replace a real connection to a real person. When I was in Israel in at the beginning of November 2023, just less than a month after October 7th, my feeling was what our Israeli family and friends were asking us to do was help carry the tremendous load of grief and trauma. It was too much. It was too much to bear. And that part of what they were asking us to do, by inviting us to see, and I walked around Kfar Aza, less than a month after October 7th. They wanted us to see the horror, and it really felt like they needed us to just help carry the load. The burden was too heavy. And I felt like, okay, if that's what you're asking us to do, then that's what we have to do. And we need to not look away, and we need to listen and we need to tell those stories. And I just spent some time with, there was a delegation of about 20 Israeli rabbis and communal leaders that came as part of one of the synagogues that I'm a member of, B'nai Jeshurun, to talk about the American-Israeli relationship through the lens of that community. And part of what they were saying now, all this time later, is that part of what they need from us now is to be paying attention to the full picture of the current reality, that they're still in the trauma so deeply. And part of what they're asking us to do as American Jews is to keep an eye on starvation in Gaza, because they're so in their own experience that they know it's a problem, but they can't focus on it. So that's something that we can do in a way that's about loving and supporting Israel and wanting Israel to be to live up to its values and to be its best self. And they need us to carry that right now. And so I'm constantly in conversation, and I think many of us are, with our Israeli friends and colleagues to hear, what do you need from us right now? What can we do for you? What do we need you to do for us? Because it has to be an ongoing conversation, and it has to be something really symbiotic.
Yeah, I've had many of those conversations as well. Haven't been on the ground in Israel much since October 7th, really only once, but Israelis who are here, who come here, who visit, who I meet at the Hartman Institute, we're getting exactly those same vibes. And interestingly, sometimes it's the line is cutting through families. Like there's someone in the family, one spouse, has sort of emerged. The heart has opened up a little bit and is able to at least begin thinking about some of the misery in Gaza, and will say, "But my spouse is not there yet. I just can't talk about it at home." Yeah, it's sad.
I just one thought about how this relates to your session, Gordon, the pluralism session, was that when we three of us on this call, and many of those who are watching us today, cope with difficult moments, it's our Jewish faith and our Jewish community that sustain us.
Yeah.
And, it's prayers that we say, and it's words that are etched on our souls from the Torah or from the tradition. And I was thinking that that's absent to a lot of Israelis who are so alienated from the Orthodox, and they're left with a vacuum, and it's so lacking. You see it, people casting around for a notion of, well, what is this Jewish state of ours going to be, and how is it going to be Jewish, and how are we going to relate to this long tradition of ours? And if we're rejecting the Orthodox answers, so what is there for us? And that what and that why and that how are urgently important right now at a time of grief and trauma. And I don't want us to go and preach and hold up, banners saying, okay, we are the way. But as Ayelet said, just by sharing who we are and how we deal with grief and with questioning, etc., is so important right now.
Look, I start with a very basic axiom that human beings are pretty much the same. Human nature is pretty much the same, whatever your language, whatever your continent is. The idea that people have tried to sell to me over the years in my activity in the Masorti movement, who was saying, don't waste your time here. Israelis not interested in religion; they're secular. Just get that through your head. You're banging your head against the wall, and to me that rings so false. Right? That is, human beings. Yes, there are some human beings. There's some small percentage of human beings who literally have no spiritual needs. But that's a tiny minority. Human beings are spiritual creatures. They just haven't had a model for it. That's what Bialik was talking about. And this is someone who's staring at the Siddur and wondering, why doesn't it speak to me? And maybe I've forgotten its language, or maybe it's forgotten mine, but the yearning is there. I mentioned this at the session itself, that one of the phenomena that we knew in the Masorti congregations in Israel over the years was, particularly on Yom Kippur, people would congregate outside the synagogues on the sidewalks, and the paradox was they needed somehow to be there in some proximity, but they couldn't go in. There was something in the in the way that they understood what goes on behind those walls to not be them, but it wasn't them to be at home on a day like that either, right? So, what you're seeing now in the wake of October 7th is a massive need for healing that I don't believe people are not praying. They may not be praying in synagogues. They may not be opening, Vanit Filati, the Masorti Sidur, or any other Sidur. But I don't believe that they're not praying in some meaningful way.
Actually, what I heard from some of these Israeli rabbis I was speaking with last week is that more people are coming to shul.
Mhm.
In Masorti synagogues and places like Beit Tfilah Israelit in Tel Aviv, at Kol Neshama, the number of Bnei Mitzvah is way, way, way up. Oded Mazor, the rabbi of Kol Neshama, was saying to me, secular Israelis who in the past would not have felt the need to mark that rite of passage in a religious communal way, want that now. That it has reawakened a sense of spiritual hunger. And, there's been a lot written about how that's playing out on this side of the ocean. I think it's part of what accounts for our increased numbers of applicants in the rabbinical and cantorial schools. We're seeing an awakening of that hunger.
Yeah, Rakeffa Ginsburg talked about that. The movement, the Masorti movement, decided to just sort of set up in Habima Square for Ne'ilah at the end of Yom Kippur, hoping they'd get a couple of minyanim there, and 1,000 people showed up for Ne'ilah. I mean, if I let myself go a little bit and imagine, the anxiety about closing doors and closing gates, and what's closing in on me, and needing to come with a desperate prayer that the gates remain open, something of that, surely, maybe not in exactly that idiom, was motivating those people.
Yeah, I mean, and they
And
do a daily Marav Minyan at Hostage Square in
yeah,
the Masorti movement. I've been there a few times for it, and it's amazing because often it'll start a fairly small circle, and then people just join. Being
Mhm.
in that space makes people want to be together, and having that language of tefillah really resonates. And that's, I think, a gift the Masorti movement has given to everybody who gathers every evening at the Hostage Square in Tel Aviv.
Now I know Ellie is gonna get us onto the right track here with questions, but I just want to say one more
It's
thing
all
just
the
to get
right
back,
track.
because the larger syndrome that Arnie referred to at the very beginning about this polarization and this bifurcation, this binary thinking, this is a larger syndrome of habits that we're familiar with it here now, but it's something that we have to break through in Israeli society. You either believe in America first, or else you believe in America last. You either believe in Jewish power and the greater Israel, or you're a person who lacks any understanding or commitment to Jewishness, which is what the prime minister has said about people who are critical of Israel. You don't understand what Judaism is about. And thus you're a danger to the whole enterprise. We've got to break through that binary. That's what I loved so much about Mandelblit.
This is actually the
Yeah.
kind of first question I was going to pose to you, which came from one of our Israeli participants who said, I find this conversation to be problematic from my perspective as an Israeli who has 4 grandchildren in the army. I don't know how many Israelis are on this Zoom meeting, but there's so much dissension in Israel, and it's a lot of binary thinking. And here people think that Trump is the Messiah, which she finds frightening. But she says, I asked for kind of a clarification, and she says, if you say something positive about the army, you're considered a traitor to the hostages. And if you support the hostages, you're considered a traitor for not supporting the right to fight Hamas. So I think that we're used to those binaries in America, but I think it's really important to point out where those binaries exist in Israel as well.
Yeah.
And do you guys have any comments on how that gray area can kind of be promoted? What can we do to promote?
Well, first of all, I just want to, relate to it, because I almost cannot imagine what it would be like to be in fear or in actual grief, and to be trapped by that kind of binary rhetoric. Where do I go? I mean, you're trapped already by circumstances, and now you're being trapped by these ideological, choices that you didn't ask for. It's really, it's adding insult to injury. It's horrible. Uh, how to break through? I think a lot of grassroots work. I think a lot of a lot of conversations like this, a lot of more convenings in Israel, as much as here. We have to promote a different way of thinking.
And I would just add, I mean, first of all, I just want to acknowledge what a hard place that is to be in, and that's so much the experience of so many Israelis right now. So many rabbis of Kehilot in Israel have talked about how, on every given Shabbat, there are 40, 50 members of the synagogue who are serving in the army at the given moment. And so when they say Amisha Berach for Chayalet Tzahal, they're praying for their own kids, and they may oppose the war, and they may feel like there aren't other good options, and they still want their kids to come home safely. And that's such a daily contradiction that's part of their lives. And it's really important for us to name that, to kind of remember that everybody is drafted into the Israeli army, and it's almost everybody still serves, and that it doesn't mean that they're supporting the government line. It doesn't mean that they're excited about the things that they're being asked to do. It means that they're serving their country. And they, so what we pray for, if we pray for the war to end, that's not about not supporting the soldiers. We want them to get home safely so that they don't have to fight anymore.
This was, we talked a lot in the convening about the lack of a constitution in Israel. It came up in multiple sessions in a myriad of ways. And so one of our participants wanted to know, is there any movement, any real movement to create a constitution? And what does that look like?
Well, if I can be a little catty here for a moment, I think we've discovered that constitutions are not self-fulfilling. They can be interpreted in nasty ways also. But look, there was there were some attempts that turned out to be abortive attempts. I don't think that there are lots of things to be said for it, and I'm not a constitutional expert, so I'm not going to get into all of that. But I do think that it's a little simplistic to imagine that that is going to be a substitute for the kind of a change in a way of thinking that we've been talking about here, because a constitution can be consistent with some very bad binary thinking that halts progress or worse in a society.
I know that Ellie shared the link of the session that I moderated earlier. Roy Peled, who's a professor of law in Israel, talked a little bit about that question and kind of where the process towards a constitution is. So if you might want to refer to his remarks. Nasreen Haddad Hajchaya also spoke about the challenges inherent in that process. So I thought, addressed that challenge very, very effectively in our session.
I think one of the things that really hit me from Roy's talk was the fact that in the Declaration of Independence, which I've read and I never taken this in, is that it actually is like, oh, the deadline for a constitution is September 1948, and we missed the deadline just a little. I think the other thing I will say is that one of the people asked if I could send out all the links. I will. And I also want to say that next week we're releasing a podcast of the series of the convening, which will include Roy Peled, Nasreen, Haj Yaya, Rakefet, a lot of these things that we've taken their talks and distilled them into like 30-minute listens. So keep an eye out for that. I'll make sure that we send the links out for that as well once they're released to the public. Arnie, I have a couple more questions. Do you have anything else you kind of want to get to before I, as we're kind of wrapping up?
Well, we convened and now we're meeting today at very difficult moments, and one wants to have some perspective in order to figure out where to go forward. And we are denied that perspective because we're in the middle of horrendous things that keep happening at an amazing pace. it seems to me that one needs to say, so I'll say it, speaking just for myself, that people are attributing all sorts of fatal flaws to Israel right now, which are not a function of the state being a state. They're a function of the leadership that the state has at the current moment. October the 7th could have been and should have been the occasion for national unity. It could have been a moment for Jewish Israelis, and not only Jewish Israelis, as we saw from the convening, for Israelis to come together facing a crisis. And instead, you have a leadership that chooses to polarize at this moment. Not unlike the leadership of the United States, which chooses to define its political rivals as enemies and traitors. And you see the same thing happening in Israel. So if you're a hostage family and you're campaigning to bring your loved ones home, you're a traitor to the state. You're denying the army the freedom of maneuver to achieve its objectives. So I think that we gotta look past this. We've got to see past the present miasma, which is threatening to overpower all of us with grief and turmoil and I don't know, binary visions. And I somehow find ourselves projecting a year or two beyond this, hopefully beyond an election that's upcoming in Israel, where we're going to see a different kind of future emerge and people will have hope again. Because if we want to unite American Jews behind Israel again, we're going to have an Israel with a vision for the future that American Jews of all sorts can get behind. And Israel is not giving us this. And it could, I think, with different leadership right now, but it's not. I don't know what my colleagues have to say about that.
Well, someone of people of our generation, I'm speaking to Arnie here now, we're easy. Because
we knew this other Israel.
We knew the other Israel. We grew up with the other Israel. Yeah. I mean, so we naturally look at these flaws as being time bound. It's, and bound to a particular kind of, political winds blowing and the political leadership. And we know that it's possible for it to be otherwise. The big problem is that, the 20-somethings right now that everyone worries so much about, and, and correctly so, but we have to be kind to them as well. They don't have the experiences never had the experiences that we had. I'm going to put it in a kind of a harsh way in a sense. What exactly has Israel done lately to make itself lovable to those people? And that's one of the things we tried to do. When I was a rabbi at the synagogue in White Plains, we would take teenagers of the 11th and 12th grade to Israel for 10 days. Every 2 years, we took 2 grades together. And one of the things that we did very, very deliberately is we knew they were going to college soon. We wanted them to see below the level of society that you generally see when you go touring in Israel. We wanted them to see, and they did see, people who were IDF veterans, who were chovshei kippah, who wore kippot, who were working for, this is through Shatil, Ayelet, who were working for Bedouin rights in the Negev. People who cared about democracy, people who cared about human rights and not only about themselves. We wanted them to see the lovable parts of Israel so they could talk about those on their college campuses and not only try to defend Bibi Netanyahu.
And they're still there, and we somehow have to highlight them and make them visible.
Yeah.
And those of us who go visiting our friends and relatives know that they're still there and hear all these stories about self-sacrifice and generosity and dialogue with between Jews and Palestinians and among Jews of different sorts, like I talked about before. So this is a reality that unfortunately gets no headlines because the headline's all about war and politics. Maybe that's part of our job, is to make sure that Israel is known.
Yeah.
Ayelet, as we're wrapping up,
I'm going to give Ayelet the last word.
Oh, well, I have one more thing I want to add before we actually officially wrap up. Because I think that this is this real question of where we're getting information and what our sources are. Someone said, can you guys recommend good, unbiased resources on the history of Israel and Zionism? And they said just books. And I think they were looking historically, but I think this is a question for where are you getting information in a time in which information is so hard to come by? But Ayelet, feel free to go with either direction.
We should come back to you and with answers, Ellie, and you'll put it out somehow.
Right.
Yes.
And actually, Dr. Eisen teaches a really important class for our students on the history of Zionism and Zionist thinking, which has both an undergraduate Liz College version and a rabbinical school version. And we actually were just gathering with the graduating students, talking about moments that really stood out for them about, through their time at JTS. And a number of them talked about your class and how those conversations and that reading really made them think much more deeply than they ever had. And so absolutely, I hope that you will share with this group some of those sources, books, and I think also we should share some news sources. I mean, as we all know, it's really important to read multiple sources, that if we're getting all of our news from only one place, then we're going to have the editorial bias of whatever that place is. And so if we expose ourselves to multiple sources, then we can try to be aware of different perspectives. And depending on how much time you're willing to give it, think about how much you want to read on a regular basis. I try every week to be reading Haaretz and Times of Israel, and something more centrist like the Jerusalem Post, and also something more to the left like 972, which is a news magazine, so that I have a range of opinions and a range of kind of op-eds, but also up to the minute news. But you have to decide kind of how much can you consume. It's not necessarily going to leave you in a better mood than when you started to read. I mean, I guess I'll just end by saying I'm probably the last generation that remembers the good times that, I volunteered for the Rabin campaign and was at the party when he was, elected prime minister. And I remember optimistic days of Oslo when I was in college. Kind of the big thing that was going on my campus was Jewish-Palestinian dialogue and the sense of possibility and hope. And then the years of terror and fear that followed that and the unraveling. And I think a lot as we talk to the next generation of Jewish leaders, our students here, Liz College students and rabbinical and cantorial students and education students who are going to be teaching the next generation, how do we give them that sense of historical perspective and emotional depth and connection, and make sure that they really have their own relationship to lean on. And that's why we so strongly emphasize the importance of spending real extended time in Israel and making connections with Israeli colleagues who will be then their lifetime connections of people that they can call and say, what do you think is happening right now? And are you okay? I heard there was a siren, and what's happening with your kids, and all of those questions, because it has to be real. It has to be personal. We need to take it really, really personally. None of it is theoretical.
Amen. I think it may be important to add one thing here, that just to forestall any objections from wherever, that we shouldn't be mythologizing the old Israel either. They also made mistakes, some of which are still being paid for. But there's a big difference between a society that makes mistakes and in which you can begin to have conversations about those mistakes without being told that you're a traitor to the Jewish people and a traitor to the Jewish cause. And it's not like there's ever a time when we don't make mistakes, but it's what a society is willing to be open to and what it's willing to hear. And that has been a fundamental change. And I think, those of us who remember a different time are easier to reach. And but we're not going to be here that much longer. I don't mean to be, morbid about it, but we have to worry about the people who are going to be here for a long time.
I want to thank all three of you for your time. I know this is an incredibly busy time of year at JTS, so appreciate you guys making time to share with us. And I will be sending both the video links and the sources that I'll gather from our speakers today. Thank you for being part of this series, and we will keep you in touch with what's coming next from JTS Learning. And that'll include podcasts and some other things. And if there's anything else that you're interested in, please let us know. Arnie, thanks for being a thought partner on this. And actually, one of the things that I go back to is my real introduction to this was the class I took on Zionism with you when I was an undergrad.
no.
So it's so nice. I'm sitting here, I'm looking, I can see the books all lined up just there, waiting. So I'm excited to see which books are still on your syllabus. Thanks again to our sponsor for today, Yale Asbel. And again, thank you for participating and being part of this conversation.
Thank you all.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.